Hey, Allison Verhalen here with AV Writing Services, and today I want to talk to you about duplicate content because no one likes the copycat, right? We were all taught growing up when we were in school that we should only turn in work that was 100% our own work because no one likes a copycat, right? And that carries over into adulthood to a certain extent, especially with content marketing, because if someone can get your content somewhere else, why would they come to you if they can get the same thing somewhere else? The whole point of content marketing is to position yourself as an authority and convince people that you know more than anyone else about this particular subject because you are the expert, right? Well, if they can get the same content somewhere else, they have no reason to come to you. So, we're going to talk about what duplicate content is. Duplicate content is when the same piece of content appears in two places online, right? So most of the time we think of this happening when someone scrapes the content from your website and posts it onto their own website. That certainly does happen, but that's not the only time that duplicate content can happen. We're going to talk a lot about your URL and how different URLs leading to the same page on your website can make Google think that there's duplicate content there, even though it's just two URLs leading to the same page, right? It makes Google think, because there are two URLs, makes Google think there are two different pages with identical content, in which case that can really hurt your SEO. So how does duplicate content hurt your SEO? Well, Google doesn't always rank the right URL, right? Google does its best to figure out which one is the original and to put that higher in the rankings than the copycat, but it doesn't always work out that way, and not as well as Google would like it to, right? So sometimes the duplicate content is the one that ranks higher. And again, this holds true for your URLs. So let's say, like, for example, I use Buffer to schedule my social media posts and share my blog and sometimes my service pages onto social media, right? So I have one day where I do all my social media scheduling and it goes out throughout the week and I don't have to worry about it. Well, that creates a different page or a different URL for that same page. So now instead of it being, avwritingservices.com slash, it's the date and then the blog post. Then it shows up as avwritingservices.com slash post UTM content buffer medium social, right? There's a lot more in there, but I'm not going to read it all off. You get the idea. There's a whole lot more tacked onto the end of my URL because Buffer does that for me, right? So now when you click to social media, click to my website from social media, you click that link, the URL that shows up there that you're on is going to have that longer URL as opposed to just avwritingservices.com slash blog slash title, right? It's much longer than that. So now Google tags that, indexes, categorizes that content, sees, okay, that's a whole other page when it's not. And sometimes, like I said, Google doesn't always rank the right page. Sometimes the wrong page gets ranked higher in the rankings. If people see that longer URL in the Google search results, they're going to be less likely to click on it because it looks suspicious. If you've just got avwritingservices.com slash blog slash, title, okay, they know it's a blog post. They know what they're getting themselves into. But that longer URL at the end, not everyone understands what that means or where that came from, and it can look a little sketchy. So they're going to be less likely to click on it. And guess what? Google tracks what gets clicked and what does not. So if it's on, let's say, the first page of Google search results for your target keyword, great, but no one clicks on it. So Google goes, okay, this is not what people are looking for when they're searching this particular keyword. It's going to drop that in the rankings. And no, it will not just replace it with the duplicate content, which is actually the original piece of content, right? It's probably going to rank it with, replace it with something from a different website, possibly one of your competitors. It will, and that can inhibit the SEO of your website overall. Google will then be less likely to rank any page or post from your website just because it did not prove to be valuable. So now it thinks that your whole website is a little sketchy. So That's another way that it can hurt you. Backlink dilution is another one, right? So backlinks are a great way to convince Google that you really know what you're talking about. You are the authority in your industry, because people are linking back to your website. They are referring to the content on your website, which means you're the authority. That's great. Well, if you have multiple URLs, let's say you have 2 URLs leading to the same page, maybe one URL gets a bunch of backlinks, and the other URL gets, let's say, another 100 backlinks, and the first URL gets 100 backlinks. Now they each have 100 backlinks, when instead you could have one page with 200 backlinks, which would really improve your SEO, right? So when you have that backlink dilution, it's like you're fighting yourself. You're competing with yourself to rank for those relevant searches. And next, crawling is limited, right? So Google, again, crawls all the content out there on the website in theory, so that it can figure out, keywords, length, publication date, backlinks, all that good stuff. It can do it much, much faster than any human possibly can. But it does still take time. It is still limited in how long it takes to crawl and rank any given piece of content. This is why I say that you have to wait 2 to 3 months for a piece of content to rank organically after it's been published, because that's about how long it takes for Google to crawl everything, right? So when you have the same piece of content appearing in multiple places, maybe only one of them gets crawled. Maybe the other one does not. And again, that's how you can end up with the wrong piece of content showing up on Google, because maybe Google only had time to crawl that duplicate content and did not have time to crawl the original piece of content and index that. So that is why how it can hurt. And then whether or not there's a penalty for duplicate content. So it makes sense that there would be a penalty, right? Because Google has said that it prioritizes original content, which then the opposite of that would be, okay, then that means that duplicate content gets punished, right? Well, Google has said that there is no penalty for duplicate content most of the time. It has this, so if you've got the multiple URLs, Google is not going to actively penalize you for that. But if your website has a lot of crawled content, a lot of content that was scraped from another website, pasted on your website, and it sees that, especially from other websites like Amazon, if it sees that copied content and it does not see that you're really adding any new content, anything that really adds value to the user, then Google can penalize you for that. But again, Google's not perfect. Google does not catch every website that does that. And again, sometimes it can mistake the original content for the copied content. So that is why why duplicate content is a problem. Now, what causes it? We've got faceted/filtered navigation. So for example, if you're an e-commerce store, let's say you're selling t-shirts and you've got a page for, white short sleeve t-shirts for women, right? Well, then you've got the different sizes. You've got, let's say, small, medium, large. You probably have a lot more than that, but just to keep things easy. Now you've got the size. If people click on that because they're looking at the size of that particular t-shirt, now that looks like a whole other page, but the content isn't any different. The description is the same. If you include a history of it, right? All that content is going to be the same. So that can show up as duplicate content because that's 2 URLs leading to the same thing. So that can be a problem. Tracking parameters are another problem. So if people click to through to the page of your website from, let's say, your newsletter, there's a little UTM that tracks where people are coming from when they get to your website. So it would look like, for example, avwritingservices.com/blog post/title, and then there's a question mark, UTM, source equals newsletter, right? So again, that shows up as another URL that can make Google think that it's duplicate content when really it's the same piece of content. They're just getting there from 2 different ways. Same with session IDs. If people are, if you're tracking people and the different things that they're doing on your website, the pages they're viewing, how long they're sticking around, where they're coming from. Again, sometimes you create that session ID, which again shows up at the end of your URL. So now you've got avwritingservices.com session ID equals blah, 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 right? And you've got it different for each person who shows up. So now you have a whole bunch of URLs on the same piece of content. So that can look like duplicate content. If you have HTTPS versus HTTP, or www versus non-www, right? So HTTP or HTTPS, that determines whether or not you have an SSL certificate, right? You should have an SSL certificate for your website. At this point, it comes pretty standard with every hosting subscription. So in that case, if it's activated, first of all, make sure it's activated. Your website will show up as https.com/avwritingservices.com as an example, right? If you don't have an SSL certificate, it will appear as http://avwritingservices.com, right? So, but if you have not put a redirect in there, people, if they just put in HTTP automatically, then that's going to show up. And maybe that leads directly to your content. If you don't have a redirect, you need to have a redirect. Otherwise, it looks like duplicate content. I just did an SEO audit for a client a couple weeks ago, and we ran into this problem. They have an SSL certificate. All their pages should be HTTPS, but we realized that there were some pages that had HTTP. So they could be viewed as HTTP, which first of all, that means that they are not secure. So Google's not going to rank them, but it also shows up as duplicate content. You want to make sure you have a redirect. Same with www, whether or not you have that before your website or not, totally up to you. Just make sure that it's consistent and make sure that you have the redirect that gets people to the one that you prefer, whether it's with or without the www, doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So in both of those cases, you can fix it with a redirect. Case sensitive URLs. So you may not realize this because I was surprised not too long ago to realize that URLs are actually case sensitive. So if you have, I could have, for example, avwritingservices.com where AV is capitalized and the rest is lowercase, or I could have it all lowercase. By the way, it is all lowercase. So just so you're aware. But not everyone knows that, right? Most people, I know my default has always been lowercase in URLs. So if someone else types in something that's all lowercase and they get to that page, then again, it looks like two URLs. It looks like duplicate content. So that can cause problems. Trailing slashes versus non-trailing slashes. This is when at the top of your website, you can have, again, for example, avwritingservices.com/ or just avwritingservices.com without a slash at the end. Again, doesn't matter which way your website goes, just make sure that it's consistent. And so whenever you're linking back to particular pages on your website, make sure that you either always include that slash or never include that slash. Just make sure you're consistent and make sure you have a redirect. So if someone tries to go to one and you want them to go to the other, make sure you've got that redirect so they always land on that same page. That can prevent the creation of duplicate content via multiple URLs that lead to the same page. Print-friendly URLs. If you want to make certain pages of your website print-friendly, it shows up as, again, example, avwritingservices.com/print/page, right? Rather than avwritingservices.com/page. Again, this creates a new URL that can make Google think it's duplicate content. You can still have print-friendly versions of your web pages. I'm not saying that you can't. Just be sure to canonicalize the original so Google doesn't get confused, right? When you canonicalize it, which I'm probably mispronouncing, right? That's just a way to tell Google, this is the original piece of content. Ignore the rest. This is what you want to focus on. Mobile-friendly URLs and AMP URLs, right? All our content needs to be mobile-friendly because everyone is mobile these days. They are all consuming content on their phones and on their tablets. The problem is, again, that can create another URL. If you've got, again, avwritingservices.com, the mobile would be m.avwritingservices.com, or you've got accelerated mobile pages, AMPs, that can appear as, again, I'm using my own website as the example, avwritingservices.com/AMP/page. So again, you've got a new URL that leads to the same content that can make Google think that there is duplicate content. So to make sure this does not cause problems for your SEO strategy, again, canonicalize the desktop version, or you can use the rel alternate tag in your URL, which is just to tell Google the URL for the mobile friendly versions or the AMP version, right? So that's just a way to tell Google, this is alternate content. Here's the original content. It's not duplicate. It's just an alternate. That can help prevent the issue of duplicate content. All right. Tag and category pages. So I'm just going to come right out and say don't use tags in your content. They're useless. Don't do it. Category pages. You should have categories because that can help Google, again, index, categorize, figure out what your content is all about. But if you only have one piece of content in a given category, if people go to that page and they only see one post, well, now that looks like duplicate content because they can go to that category page and see the same content as they would see if they go to just that blog post. So that can make it look like duplicate content. It also just doesn't look very good from a viewer's perspective. If someone is visiting your website and they see that, now it just looks weak and thin and not great. So make sure that you have a robust library with a ton of content in each of your categories. I do this. One of the top ways that I look for content when I'm, when I'm stuck for ideas and trying to figure out what to write about next for my blog is I will go to my categories and see what have I not covered recently? What needs to be covered? That is a great way to try to evenly distribute content across my different categories as much as possible, just to prevent that issue of the category pages creating duplicate content. Attachment URLs, if you include images, in attachment image URL. Sorry. If you include images in your content, which you should, your website might automatically create a separate page dedicated to the image that just shows the image and some boilerplate copy. Again, that can look like duplicate content. You can just use the Yoast plugin to disable dedicated pages for images on your website. Takes care of that problem before it ever starts. Paginated comments. If you have lots and lots and lots of comments on your blog, great, good for you. That means you have tons of traffic going to your blog and people are engaging with it, or it means you have a bunch of robots. That's the other problem, right? So if it goes into the multiple pages category, now you've got your website. Again, I'll use mine as an example, avwritingservices.com/post. And then you have avwritingservices.com/post/comment page 2, page 3, et cetera, et cetera. So the different ways you can avoid this is you can turn off comment pagination. So all of the comments appear on one page. You can use no index tags on your comment pages, which is a way to tell Google, don't index these pages, forget about them. They pretend they don't exist. You can turn off comments altogether on your blog. What I do is I close comments after 2 weeks on my blog, which again prevents robots spamming me, but it also reduces the chances that you'll have to worry about comment pagination. Localization. So let's say you have different versions of your website. You've got a US version, a UK version, and an Australia version. Those will all have slightly different URLs, but English is the primary language in all 3 of those countries. So the content is going to be essentially the same, right? That can look to Google like duplicate content. You can use the hreflang tag, HREFLANG tag, to avoid getting penalized for that content, right? That's a way of telling Google same content, different countries, same language. I know it looks confusing. It's not. Search results pages. So if you have a search box on your website, so people can search for a particular page or post or category, the resulting search will take you to a new URL, which is likely to have the same content as other URLs on your website. So for example, on avwritingservices.com, if you're looking for example, my SEO audit, it would come up as avwritingservices.com and then the question mark with SEO audit, which looks it might lead to the same thing as the URL that just leads straight there, right? avwritingservices.com/SEO audit. So that can cause a problem. So in order to do that, again, just use those no indexed tags. Google says that it tends to avoid ranking URLs that contain search or results in the URL. But again, Google's not perfect. So just to help it along, you can use those no index tags just to really make extra sure that Google's algorithm does not index those pages. Finally, your staging environment. So if you have a website used for testing, you can have a copy of your website for testing purposes. This is known as a staging environment. So it can be a great way to try out new content and strategies, but before you put it live on your website, but it can also create duplicate content. So be sure to use those no index tags to prevent Google from indexing the content that you're just testing, you're playing around with. You don't want that to count towards your SEO strategy. until you're ready to publish it. So now we know that it's a problem. We know how duplicate content can be created. How do we check for duplicate content? Number one is an SEO audit. Like I said, I caught that for a client recently, that they had those HTTP not redirecting to HTTPS. That's a problem for duplicate content. So do that SEO audit. That can catch those URL problems for you. When it comes to people scraping and copying your content, use a content checker. I use Copy Sentry. It's totally free. You just put copy and paste your content into Copy Sentry, and it will tell you if it's copied content or if it's original. You can also do this if you hire a writer, such as myself, to create content for your website. You can put it through Copy Sentry before you put it on your website, just to make sure it's original. There are some not great writers out there who will just either copy and paste content or kind of rewrite content, but not make it super original, and they'll turn it in as original work. So just to make sure you're not getting scammed, use Copy Sentry. What to do with duplicate content. So you found duplicate content on your website. What do you do about it? Again, I mentioned this throughout the video. You got the no index tags, canonicalizing certain pages of your website. Those are probably the biggest ways that you can prevent that problem when it comes to those URLs. When it comes to people copying your content and pasting it onto their website, there's really nothing you can do about that, unfortunately. You should just go in and rewrite that content, preferably not the author of the content. You should have someone else do the rewrite, just because the author is always so close to the content that it can be hard for them to rewrite it. So you should bring in a professional such as myself to take care of that for you. So that is it. That is everything I have to say to you about duplicate content. I know this was a longer video than I normally like to make, and it got a little complicated, a little more techy than a lot of my videos. So if you have any questions about the URLs or the tags, how all that works, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at info@avwritingservices.com, and you can find more content like this elsewhere on my channel and on my website, AV as in Victor, writingservices.com. Otherwise, have a great week and happy blogging.